there's a real importance and a real value in setting the stage as a leader. So really focusing in on psychological safety, on creating clear and transparent expectations for your team so that they know what to expect from you. There's less uncertainty. They know what to expect from each other, and they have made clear what they expect from you as a leader. Also important to that is creating space for routines and rituals, ensuring that informal and formal work is celebrated, that there's a place for play and buffoonery, as well as good work and meaningful conversation and feedback. These are really important elements for a creative workspace so that people can bring their whole and authentic selves to work and do their best.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are and wherever you're watching from. My name is Matt Pierce, host of the Visual Lounge, where we talk about using images and video in the workplace. Today, we are going to be talking about something I think everyone's probably experiencing to some degree, which is that version of remote work. Whether it's full-time or part-time, you're doing it at some level, you can know it's probably going to be challenging if you've never done it before. If you're doing it full-time and been doing it for a while, you're probably like, thank goodness all these people understand a little bit more of what I'm going through. It's got some challenges. And particularly, we're going to be talking with Emily Whitmer about this. And she's going to walk us through some things that we can be thinking about, help us to understand how we can do it a little bit better and how to succeed and how to fail, things like that. So let's dive right into introducing Emily. Emily Whitmer is a doer, a dreamer, and a true believer of the potential of people and the power of learning. She has spent her training career working in various cultures, languages, and business sectors, including international development, nonprofit, higher education, and is currently in the corporate sector of Southwest Airlines. For the past 5 years, Emily has been leading creative teams in the learning and development space. And with that said, let's welcome Emily to the Visual Lounge. Hi, Emily.
Hey, Matt. So happy to be here.
So grateful that you decided to join me after briefly meeting you at DevLearn. It's so just wonderful to have you here. So you ready to dive in? We got some questions to go through.
Oh, yeah. Let's do this. Let's go.
All right. So I'm curious. You've done a lot of things. You've had a lot of experiences. How did you get involved with and first start using remote work?
Yeah, that's a great question. My professional life and career trajectory kind of started in the international development space, working across culture, across different languages. And in that space, I became acutely aware of the importance of visuals, of demonstrating and showing things as you're learning. And one of my earlier roles specifically really had a lot of influence in my trajectory. So I was in an international nonprofit. And, a lot of learning and development roles don't necessarily fall within a learning and development team sometimes. So I had a training role that was within a membership team. And, it was part training, but it was also a lot of listening and bringing information and tools back to the international headquarters. And so through that process, I was like supporting this huge geographical swath of land. So I had like 5 time zones in Russia, like all of Canada, like New England, some islands, so it was like a huge geographical space. And I was traveling to these places, on a monthly basis, but in between trips, I found myself really relying on, video conferencing tools, on meaningful moments and kind of creating relationships in virtual spaces. And that early kind of experience in my career really shaped how I think and how I use virtual tools to help support relationships, to help sustain work, and to really make meaning out of what we do. So it was pretty transformative. So that's kind of where I got my starts, if you will.
That's awesome. It sounds like that's a lot of experience in maybe a fairly short amount of time to be traveling that much and figuring out how to communicate with people all over the world, for sure. So let's ask this. How do you, this is a super broad question, but how do you define success for leading a team remotely? Because, maybe there's probably lots of things, but I'm curious, kind of top high level, what would you say are the big things to focus on?
Yeah, I think that's such a great question and a really hard one to answer. I think that the first thing that I look at when considering like what is success and what does it mean, how do you measure it, really is to kind of like look at the context of your workplace, look at the values, the mission, the vision, and make sure that like your goals are like aligned, and also that you have like some kind of measurable KPIs like to kind of help benchmark your successes. So, taking that into consideration, I think the most quintessential and important piece to really focus on when talking about remote success for a team is really to listen in, ask intentional questions, and really learn from like your team and your horizontal partners, your project partners, to kind of help shape not just like what you're doing, but like how you're doing it, right? So I'll often look at those factors as well as like maybe my individual kind of goals. Maybe there's new methods, maybe there's things I'm learning from other people that I want to try and implement. So, how do I kind of find the confluence of those factors, define what I want to do, figure out how to measure it, and like figure out how to communicate it, you know?
Yeah.
So,
Well, it sounds like obviously you've got like success often for businesses is whatever the business goal is, right? Like make money, drive revenue, or that's the same things. Whatever it is that the business want. But it does feel like that what I'm hearing though is that for the team, there's going to be maybe these other metrics that you could use to develop or to grow or to obviously whatever it is that the team needs to help be successful in achieving those, higher level outcomes that you're looking for. So,
yeah, absolutely. I think right now, kind of like in the remote space, I think there's a lot of, I don't want to say like concern, but like maybe a lot of focus on productivity in the remote world, right? People aren't coming into the office and you can't physically see someone come in to do work, right? So
right.
that is kind of like a cultural shift. And so, kind of focusing on metrics and kind of telling that story of productivity, I think is really important to businesses, but also like to people, sustaining and maintaining a culture of psychological safety, of tools and resources and just-in-time reference materials that help people do their work and maintain and help foster like the relationships that they need to do that meaningful work. Because ultimately, I don't know, my personal like mo, it's like it's about the people, and it's about making sure you have like satisfied and productive people like who you work with.
Yeah, I want to be seen that I am productive, I am helpful, I am doing the things that
Yeah.
the company values. So I appreciate that. Well, let's move on to our next question. What is one tip you could give the audience to help and use images or video better in their work? Specifically, we'll ask about in remote work. So any good tip for us to help us be better at remote work with using images or videos?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've really like leaned upon a lot of people in the L&D field to kind of help me kind of build my skill and knowledge in this area. But viewing meetings as a production, as a moment that actually matters, not just kind of an information dump, right? Because we know that like telling isn't training, telling isn't, a great way of distributing information, right? And in the workplace that is virtual, it's so easy to have meeting fatigue. It's so simple to schedule a quick meeting versus, shooting an email or, I mean, kind of like the most effective way is like maybe creating a short video or creating a visual aid and distributing that. So anytime you can kind of visually document and demonstrate and show what it is you're trying to convey and communicate, it's really it reduces cognitive load, and it helps people get the information they need when they need it.
Yeah, I love that you understand clearly that the cost is there, right? And I think this is where people, Emily, help me understand if I'm wrong here, but people struggle, especially leaders. There's that cost of business of like, oh, if I'm going to do something that's more effective, like a visual aid or a video, it feels like, oh gosh, it's so hard to do compared to maybe a long email or some other alternative. just scheduling a meeting, it feels like, gosh, that because it's hard for me, I don't want to do it. But that the reality is, that should be the equation should be flipped. Like, what's going to be across the team? What's easier for them? Is that accurate?
100%. Yeah. Taking the extra time to document, to share information that can be referenced easily. Um, it is kind of a key element of an effective team is having that ecosystem of information available. Um, and so taking the extra time to make things explicit. I think this also kind of gets into a really important leadership concept of like being very transparent and explicit with your expectations, right? Being an effective communicator of what those are and what you expect or what you're trying to convey and communicate. It really does, it fosters psychological safety on your team. It helps, kind of like have those easy reference and documentation that your team might need for like knowledge transfer, knowledge management, and those small labors and efforts in the long run, I think they really do make a large impact.
Yeah, for sure. And I know I've been a benefit of that. We have a great VP at TechSmith in our marketing department. She's always sharing like share outs and videos. Like instead of saying like, let's have another meeting about this topic, and she's really good about saying it's an 8-minute video, but if you watch it at time and a half, it will take you whatever the length of, however long it takes to watch it at time and a half speed. But, Emily, we've been talking a lot about, remote work, and there's remote work, there's hybrid work, there's asynchronous work, there's all these types of work now that in-person work we didn't. I think 10 years ago I didn't think about like the different types of work. It was either like you're here in the office or you're someplace else. But for you, when you're thinking remote work, for those who are listening and maybe saying, well, what do you mean by remote work? Is what I'm doing remote work, or does some variation of that remote work? What does that look like for you generally? How would you define it?
Yeah, that's a really great question. To me, when I think about remote work and what that is and how it's different, and sometimes similar to other types of remote, or rather of work, um, remote work really is about the digital ecosystem and the systems and processes that help kind of sustain our workplace, right? And remote work has culture, it has interaction, it has significance, and it has different mechanisms that like make it possible, right? Um, that look a little different than if you're in a hybrid situation, or an asynchronous workplace. So to me, and I'll be honest, like a lot of people kind of define this a little differently, but to me, it is really about the systems and processes that maintain and sustain that remote workplace.
Okay, perfect. I love it. So one of you mentioned this a little bit, that asynchronous work could be a little bit different, but I'm assuming remote work could be synchronous or asynchronous. Hybrid work could be synchronous, asynchronous, and in person probably a little less asynchronous. But I'm curious on your thoughts, because I know at TechSmith we've talked a lot about asynchronous work and the role that it has, especially as we, like in the month of July, we have this policy now. It's work anywhere, and I mean there's certain limitations to that, but like no expectation to come into the building. Even now, it's like a 20% time we go into the building per month or whatever. So I'm curious, what role does asynchronous work have in either supporting in any of these types of work? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, a lot of different thoughts about that. I think like one of the just kind of looking at our industry and how it is kind of in its current state. Really, a lot of our work is project based. There is a lot of individual heads down time, uh, a more of a focus on like outcome than output, or like clocking in, clocking out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that these factors really help kind of, they're very conducive to asynchronous work, right? Where it's really about like, hey, I've produced this, and you have that flexibility. And I think where remote work kind of helps to support asynchronous work, or where they can be similar, is a lot of them like rely on the same kind of systems and processes, right? You definitely need kind of your communication channels well defined, your file structure, well defined, in how you save work or where it goes, how you get feedback or input. A lot of those systems and processes help to, I guess, like kind of support asynchronous work. But there's a lot of asynchronous work, I think, happens in the remote workplace as well. So,
Yeah, I love that, right? The systems are kind of mutually connected in terms of it makes your life easier if you have a well organized system. You're either way you decide to work, or multiple kind of combinations of work, seems like it would make sense. So, so one thing you've mentioned, I think a couple of times at least, is, and I've heard you talk about this before, is this idea of psychological safety. And I'm really curious because, in this show, we're often talking, we're talking about things like color, we're talking about creating videos, and psychological safety is not something that comes up very often. So I'm curious what you mean by that, and why is it so important, particularly when we're starting to think about people in these environments that are different and away from whether you as a team lead or a manager or whatever it might be. Like, why does it matter, and what is it that we should be considering with remote work?
yeah, that's a really great question. So, this was kind of a newer concept to me as well, when I, started kind of leading fully remote teams. The term psychological safety, it kind of comes out of like Harvard Business School. Great scholar Amy Edmondson, who I've read a lot of her work. She has a lot of brilliant work out there. But it's this concept that essentially you can bring your whole self to work, and you're able to kind of speak up, even when it's kind of in contradiction, or it's a divergent opinion, without kind of facing like ridicule or shame or something like that, because you have a different opinion or perspective. Um, so, why I'm really intrigued by this concept is because, a lot of work that is done, in L&D, especially like, in the visual space, is creative, right? It is a place where, bringing your whole and authentic self to work is a true asset. And being part of a team that sustains, that respects, and that understands and is open to that will help people to kind of bring their best work, their time, their true talents, and their true self to work, right?
Yeah.
Um, Now, this kind of concept of psychological safety, uh, it also is more difficult to translate into a remote setting at times. So I started kind of thinking about like, okay, what does this look like in a remote setting, and how can you sustain and foster it? Uh, so I I really tried to like emphasize, okay, what are the things that I can put in place that will help to support psychological safety in a remote space? So those became things like making sure that expectations are transparent, that anything regarding remote work, anything that's uncertain or a little bit gray, like for example, okay, I have a doctor's appointment. I'd really like to kind of flex my core business hours to go to this doctor's appointment. I don't really want to take sick time, but what is your policy? Or like as a leader, how do you apply that policy to remote work? So any of these items that are kind of a little bit more ambiguous, kind of having that direct conversation, even documenting it out, creating a visual aid, creating a short, kind of video explaining what these things are, so you can kind of convey that tone and tenor, really, really helps to kind of foster that clear expectation, and it makes people feel more safe. Like they don't have to be on and green all the time, or you're always looking at them. um, we also kind of find that with psychological safety, having routine and ritual and a lot more touch points, intentional touch points, is really helpful to fostering that. So, for example, like relying on some different agile techniques of like having a stand up. That's not something you see in all L&D spaces, but a really helpful mechanism, just having that quick touch point, like, hey, what are you working on? What are your barriers? How can we help each other out in this quick 15-minute meeting that we have daily? So being very intentional about when your team is getting together, the expectations that they have that you've set the stage with. And also kind of like a last, I would say, highlight of psychological safety that's important in the remote workplace is to talk about failure and to embrace failure. So failure is a really, really powerful tool. And as a leader, I think framing failure in the right way is quintessential to getting good work done and making people feel safe. So a couple ways that I do this are to kind of talk about the systems and processes that we use being kind of riddled with error and being filled with failure, and kind of putting that on the system and not necessarily on the individual or on attributions that the individual might have, right? Also, it's important to kind of like frame failure in terms of like, this is part of a learning process. This is how we master concepts. This is how we try new things. This is how we innovate. And I really think that that helps people kind of give and receive more open feedback, and kind of what I like to call like scale their fail. Yeah. And lastly, just kind of talking about your own personal, I don't know, failures, missteps, I don't know, things that you tried that kind of blew up.
Yeah.
I think it's really, really important to have that humility, and to like normalize failure and trying things and experimenting.
Yeah, it's interesting as you're talking about, as we kind of went through this path of different ways of psychological safety. I think failure is a really good example. It's hard to like know, especially if you're remote, right? Like hard to know what does that? No one else must be failing. They must all be doing great because you can't see it. You're not experiencing it. And I was thinking of particularly in the environment that I work in. Right, we make a lot of video. Often asked to share out reports. We don't, instead of having a meeting, we'll do a video. And how I know I'm the exception. I'm very comfortable at what I do this a lot. So I'm like getting on camera is like no big deal for me. But the number of people that have just an aversion, we'll say, to it. They don't like it. They don't want to be it. They don't want to see themselves. They don't want to hear themselves. That's like the last thing they would want to do, even if they're okay with a live meeting, right? A virtual meeting, Zoom or whatever, it may be. And I think about like feeling safe in doing that it's okay. Or like even in a podcast like this, if you make a mistake, you say something like, I didn't say that quite the way I wanted to. I slurred my words or blah, 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 jumbled my mouth is like jumbly, whatever. Just being able to be okay with that, right? Being safe that the organization, the people in the organization aren't going to use it in a way they're not going to weaponize it against you. And I think that's, man, that when that happens, the opposite that happens when you're supported in doing those things, but that feels so good. Like, oh yeah, I messed up. I didn't say that quite right, but either no one cares or they're like, yeah, I get it. Matt had a bad day, which, if anyone's listening to the podcast where I think this is like going to be like episode 145 or 146, they know I say stupid stuff and jumble things all the time. So it should be no surprise. If you're a new listener, I apologize.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. Like having that space and having the freedom to try new things. I mean, we need that. We need that in this world, right?
Absolutely. And especially, I just, again, going back to tie it to the remote, it's like, again, if I don't see what anyone else is doing and I'm just going about kind of through my day, sure, I'm having maybe touch points here and there, but I don't know what else people are failing at or succeeding at, or unless someone says something very explicitly in Slack or in an email, or when we do have those touch points, I don't know, work gets done. It happens. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, I think it's, if we're talking about like leading remote teams and we're talking about innovation and psychological safety, praising people for failing in different ways and having that high communication and high transparency about it, that's a really powerful tool in creating psychological safety, better communication, and more authenticity in your team too, right?
Yeah. So, Emily, I want to steer the conversation a little bit into a different direction. It's still about remote work. I want to talk. We're called the Visual Lounge for a reason. So let's talk a little bit about visuals. You've mentioned, obviously setting expectations, using visuals, visual aids, videos to get people on board. So what are some of the other things that you do, particularly as a leader, to help your team, to understand, to do their work better, whatever it might be? What kind of visuals are you making on a semi-regular basis?
Yeah, so I would say one of the tools that I personally kind of really rely on, um, I use like Miro is my tool of the year. If in case you were asking, it's one of the tools of the year that I'm really obsessed with right now, particularly because I can treat team meetings more like a production. Um, Instead of saying things, I can ask for input. I even have my team draft an agenda sometimes, or I have in the past, to be like, hey, what are we talking about today? And we can do it in real time. Um, it invites participation and engagement in a different kind of way that I think makes things more meaningful. So, doing activities during your team meetings, I think it has been really powerful. Also, I would say knowledge management is huge in the virtual workplace, in the remote work setting. Um, so, having kind of like documentation is really, really key. Um, I try and I encourage everyone listening to please try to not hold terrible meetings that should have been an email. Like, have you ever been to that meeting that you're like, oh my God, this was an email. Like, this was a miss. Or like level up, right? Like this email, it should have been a video, right? Like,
Right.
yeah, yeah. So I think the more visuals that you can kind of provide for your team that have key information, like the better. Kind of some of the things I think about when differentiating between what tool and what modality I use to kind of convey information or visually represent things. Um, if I need kind of like if it's more for knowledge management, reference, we've made a decision, we've got to document it. Usually like written communication, keeping it very succinct is good, right? And saving that in a predictable place for for people, right? But I think that sometimes when you're delivering information, that your tone and your tenor really matter in kind of conveying what the words would say. I mean, that's best for like a video message, um, that your employees like can reference, or they can kind of, especially if it's like kind of a more kind of consolidated topic, like maybe you're really unpacking something and you really like they might need to kind of watch it a couple times to kind of really get the essence of what you're saying. I think that videos are a great way to do that. Also, like I think that again, using interactive tools during virtual meetings, there's a lot of great tools out there that you can use. There's a lot of like add-in features in video conferencing software these days. Like, I mean, you could even run a full-on webinar for your team meeting if you wanted to, export whiteboards. So like using visual aids that maybe you've created during a meeting. Another great way to kind of differentiate between like what type of tool and what kind of modality you want to use.
Yeah. Well, first, before I add a comment, I wanted to mention that you mentioned Miro, and if anyone's interested in learning more, we actually had Dee Capella, who is from she's the, gosh, what's her title? She's a director of
Hi.
learning, I think, at Miro. And she was on an event we had to level up. Go to TechSmith Academy, academy.techsmith.com. You can watch her conversation, which was called Video That Works Everywhere. So, perfectly placed. Emily, we did not talk about this, but you nailed it. Love it. So, it's interesting you talk about the modalities, right? And thinking about like, what can you do to enhance whatever the conversation is. And I love that you've used the phrase tone and tenor. And I love that as a way to express like what is video good at? And what I'm picking up from you particularly is that emotion, right? Like the feelings, the things that are not going to translate via written text. And I love text. We're called the Visual Lounge. We talk about images and videos, but there's nothing wrong with text. But oftentimes it lacks emotion or the nuanced understanding, is something meant to be funny and it reads terribly. You're reading like, oh, or, so I think I love that you're thinking through that and thinking through that kind of process of these different modalities. I reached out before I talked to you. I reached out to some of the folks on the team and said, hey, I'm talking to Emily, and she's been doing remote work for a while. And one of the questions I said, any questions you guys want me to ask her? Because, they're thinking a lot about on the Snagit team, how do we communicate better remotely? How do we do this using Snagit, of course? But the question they asked is like, from a leadership standpoint, when you think about the kind of the visuals you're using, and that's all across all those different kind of modalities of whether it's live to asynchronous, video or, team meeting, whatever it might be. The question they asked is like, how much time do you save or gain, do you think, by using visuals over text? And maybe it's nothing, but because I know it's also costing time to make those. So what would you say kind of beyond the benefit that they're going to understand better for you as a leader, is it giving you any kind of time savings?
Yeah. So
And be frank here, Emily. Just,
yeah.
You can tell me I'm completely, Matt, you're wrong. It's no time. This is way more work. This is hard.
Well, I'll be real with you, Matt. When building your remote ecosystem, that's a big lift. If you want to do it right, which nobody does it right. Let's be real. Everybody's iterative. Everybody's like trying and then failing and then, kind of revising what they're doing. But, there's like that time and, there's the benefit and the cost, right? And I think this goes back to like one of the questions you asked prior, which is like, how do you define success? And I think that that's really at the heart of this, right? Because there's also value. Mm-hmm. Like in your workplace, what does your team and what does your culture value? And I personally think like going back to kind of psychological safety, transparency, documentation. I think remote work is really good at making sure that things are better documented than maybe kind of like the informal workplace in-person structures that a lot of companies like kind of have relied on in the past. But I think that the value of the assets that you create when you write that email or create that document, that infographic, that visual aid, and store it in an intentional knowledge management system, I think that value to your team, to your partners, I think that is wherein lies, the value that you bring. So to answer your question, in some company cultures, that's less valued. Maybe it's more about the productivity. Maybe it's more about, that output. But if you have a remote workplace that does value, having that intentional just-in-time resource where employees know what they have access to what they need when they need it. I think building up that, digital ecosystem and having that information and those visuals available, I think it's tremendously valuable.
Yeah. Well, I gotta imagine, right? If I can go self-serve, I can find, if I'm on your team and I don't have to go to Emily and say, hey, Emily, I couldn't find this, where do I find this thing, the answer to this question? I can just go self-serve, right? It was like, that's for me, someone who, admittedly, I am not maybe the best at reaching out. I'm like, oh, I don't want to bug somebody. And so all of a sudden you've made it my life a little easier, a little bit more comfortable. You've saved me time because I don't have to do that. And then, I get all the benefit of all whatever that work is. So I love that the value, if you put value into those things as a culture, the return is going to be greater than if you're just like, hey, let's just get things done. Come on, just get it out there. I'd rather have you interrupt me 20 times in a day. No, please don't interrupt me 20 times in a day. I can't focus. Can't focus.
Well, and also like, if you empower people with that information that's on hand, the conversations they can have are maybe a little different, right? Instead of coming to you and saying, Matt, like, where do I find this like style guide? I
Hmm.
can't find it. Maybe I know where the style guide is, and maybe now I can have a conversation like, hey Matt, what do you think about this color palette for this project? What do you think about this look and feel? Is this modern? Like, we're able to have kind of a different type of conversation because we have time to.
Yeah, I love that, and I'll just. Gosh, there's so much we could talk about. Well, I'll just add this. So TechSmith, we've been remote throughout the pandemic, and when we built the building, so we're just going back into the building, but I only go in once a week, if that. But it's interesting how even those dynamics have changed since we've been remote, right? Like the time that I have with my coworkers that is in person is very different than the conversations we're having. So I think it's interesting how these all kind of play together, that you're going to you can get so much benefit from each of the different types of work that you do, and putting the value in the right place versus, and besides just productivity. Because I know there's productivity gains, and I know that's important to companies. Of course it is, because they want to make more money, right? That's the goal. But putting the emphasis in the right place makes it feel like there's really good stuff here. So you can tell I'm really
Yeah.
excited. I'm sorry, Emily. I'm going off on these tangents, but
That's okay. I'm really excited too. And, kind of going back to that, like those in person, like water cooler talk, like interactions, those are really valuable. Something I've kind of learned through my like experience, like leading remote teams and creative teams is it's really important to kind of intentionally foster those, to create space for those so that it's part of your routine and ritual, so that you have those informal kind of interactions. You might have like a Friday coffee chat or a Friday meme fest, like meme your day. So, like making time and space for a little buffoonery and some play and some not work conversations, and celebrating that as a leader, saying, yes, make time for each other, like ask about each other's lives, like supporting those interactions and making sure that that's explicit too, like that's part of what we do. It's also really important. So yeah, I feel the need to call it out too, is like creating culture in the remote place is a little bit more intentional, but definitely some of those people moments still need to be kind of like created intentionally.
yeah, I love that. We're fans of all that kind of tomfoolery and whatever else. Buffoonery, is that what we called it? I,
Buffoonery, yeah,
Yeah,
technical term. Yep.
very, very technical and scientific for anyone who's listening. So, Emily, I want to get to our speed round, but I want to ask one more question here before we do that. One of the things I'm curious about, like we talked a lot, right? I think if someone's listening to this, especially if they're a leader, there's a lot of advice here that if they just maybe glean a few nuggets from, I think they could really benefit from. But I'm curious, in all that we've talked about, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would give advice about that you think would help someone, whether they're a employee or leader in the remote space, to help them to maybe be a little bit more successful?
Yes. Something we haven't talked about, Matt, that I feel particularly passionate about mentioning is the role of onboarding employees in a remote workspace. I think often this is just kind of glazed over. Um, but, typically, like onboarding typically, has a couple kind of phases that you work through. You have like your pre-onboarding, which is, your offer, you're kind of setting up your workplace, you're signing your agreement, your contract. And then there's kind of like an orientation moment to the company, usually, right? But then there's like role specific onboarding. And I think that's a piece of the puzzle that, especially after talking to like a lot of leaders at DevLearn, they're like, oh yeah, man, onboarding, like my onboarding was trash. Like a lot of like leaders are kind of like feeling that burn, right? Myself included. I have one employee that I onboarded kind of early on um, in the pandemic, and we still joke that it was garbage. I've learned a lot from that kind of experience, and basically, like um, role specific onboarding, kind of one of the ways. And speaking of the visual lounge, like really wish I had a visual here I could show you, but kind of scaffolding an experience and making sure that you're tying kind of like goals of onboarding to certain activities, including like different meetings that you're going to have to support that goal for the new employee, as well as reference materials, like so just in time places that they can go, whether it be like links to like a SharePoint site or possibly, to a Teams channel, to Slack, where whatever you're using, as well as like different tasks that you want that employee to kind of complete to kind of check in and show that they're understanding and that they're kind of tracking, right? And that's a great asynchronous tool. So it's kind of a little bit choose your own adventure. But I mention all this just to say there are a few places you can make a bigger impact than during onboarding and creating a meaningful onboarding experience for your new employee. In the wake of the Great Resignation, a lot of people are hiring. The remote workplace is kind of a great marketing tool for a lot of employers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, really kind of leveraging remote work and making a meaningful role specific onboarding experience. It's something that every leader should really be focusing in on.
No, great advice, and one that I think is well needed in these times of, because that's going to be a differentiator, right? Like you're going to all of a sudden, if you're especially if you're remote, how do you get the culture? How do you understand how process works? How do you understand these things? Unless someone's explicit about it, because I know, and I've been at TechSmith for I'm like ancient of days, 16 plus years now, like which is a long time at any kind of technology company. But it's like, but how else if I went to a new place, how would I know if I was remote? Like you just don't get those things unless it is, as you said, explicit. So I think that's wonderful advice. So thank you for that. So Emily, let's dive into our speed round questions. These are meant to be fast, quick kind of questions, answers, but we always start off with a little stinger here. So here we go.
Okay.
All right, Emily, we're going to do speed round. Now, as I mentioned to you before the show started, I actually roll a 12-sided die, which you found to be extremely nerdy, which I agree. It is super nerdy.
Yep.
I did not 3D print these, but I have three of them, so you can choose your color. Do you want blue and gold, black and white, or a marbly green with white letters? Any preference?
I'm a Spartan. Marbly green. Yep.
That's right. Marbly green. So MSU, Michigan State, where I literally just point that way, just to the north a little bit, and I can ride my bike there, even in wintertime when it's snowy. It's not that far. So, okay, let me switch over here to our dice cam so we can see. Oh man, everything got turned and twisted. So we're gonna just do this real quick. Guys, this is a show. It's me just adjusting a dice mat. Here we go. Let's see if it will roll into it. Everything got messed up. Okay, you can't see it, but I'm gonna move it into the camera. I did not twist or turn it. There we go. Oh, I still missed the camera. There we go. It's an 11. It works so much better in concept. If you're listening to podcasts, it's all messed up. The camera's all twisted and turned. Okay, so question 11. You've talked about a lot of resources, and this doesn't have to be related to remote work, but what's one resource you think everyone should know about? Anything that you got in your back pocket you think, man, this is just could be a book, could be a podcast, could be a video series, it could be whatever you like.
Oh, man. Oh man, so many. Okay, so a great resource for me, yours truly. I really enjoy LinkedIn Learning. I like creating my own learning journey, my own learning path. I do that frequently. Also an ATD member and can't say enough about national and local chapter membership. I learn a lot through people and meeting people, making connections. And so for me, those are like wonderful resources. I get a lot of mentorship through those resources as well.
Yeah. LinkedIn Learning, fan. ATD, a fan. They do great stuff. They've got a great podcast. If anyone's looking for yet another podcast to listen to, I highly recommend it. Okay, so let's go with our next question here. Let's see if it can stay on to the... Oh, totally missed the camera area. So it's a 1 though. So we're rolling lots of 1s today. So we went from question 11 to question 1. It's funny you brought this question up. It's where do you turn for inspiration? Before the show, we're talking she's like, whoa, this question, I got the answer. So Emily, where do you turn for inspiration?
Yeah, I turn to a couple different places for inspiration. One is a lot of like thought leaders like in the L&D community. I'm constantly reading different books and leaning. I'm like the succubus of everyone else's knowledge, right? So I really like lean in on a lot of experts. So a couple of books that have recently inspired me. L&D's Playbook for the Digital Age, great read. I'm still kind of processing that book. A lot of great information there. Megan Torrance, a lot of her information on like Agile for instructional designers. I really, really love her work. Also, kind of in a different kind of bucket of inspiration, I just more generally really look to connect with and ask intentional questions to people who are very different than myself. So I, this past year, have found myself kind of like connecting more with people who come from different disciplines, like especially like the theater or fine arts, and have really learned a lot about like storytelling and conveying messages through like different types of visual communication. So whenever I can meet with somebody who has like a very different life experience or discipline or just looks at the world differently than me, I am there for it. I'm intentionally like curious and asking all the questions.
Well, I love that, especially the last part, because yeah, there's so much we can learn from other groups. And I learn, even in kind of a business workplace, I learn a lot from our sales team. I learn a lot from our UX team. You know, they have different philosophies or different ideas about how things get put together, but you know, it's still valuable. And we'll have to let Megan know that you name dropped her today on the show, because Megan's a good friend of mine. So she's also in Michigan. So not that you're not here anymore, but a former Spartan, you know, we'll take it.
Oh, yeah, no, she's incredible. Love her work.
Well, Emily, thank you so much for spending time with me today. All your depth of knowledge, your great information. Obviously, so much more there we could explore. I'm curious, if people want to reach out to you and connect with you, where should they do that? What's a good place?
Yeah, the best place I would say like on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. Feel free to send me a message. My email information is also connected to my bio there. So please feel free to reach out.
As we like to wrap up, Emily, we've talked about a lot of different things, but we want to give you a chance to give your final take.
My final take on remote work is just that there's a real importance and a real value in setting the stage as a leader. So really focusing in on psychological safety and creating clear and transparent expectations for your team so that they know what to expect from you. There's less uncertainty. They know what to expect from each other, and they have made clear what they expect from you as a leader. Also important to that is creating space for routines and rituals, ensuring that informal and formal work is celebrated, that there's a place for play and buffoonery, as well as good work and meaningful conversation and feedback. These are really important elements for a creative workspace so that people can bring their whole and authentic selves to work and do their best.
Fantastic. Well, Emily Whitmer, thank you so much for joining me here in the Visual Lounge.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Absolutely. We'll have to do it again sometime. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Visual Lounge. Hopefully you got some great ideas about improving remote work, hybrid work, asynchronous work, whichever flavor that you're in. Go get that psychological safety. Go document more so that you have it. Emily's got great advice, and you can find her again on LinkedIn. So go connect with her. And as we like to say every time at the end of the Visual Lounge, whatever you are, wherever you're doing, we hope you take a little bit of time to level up every single day. Thanks, everybody.